Kia ora, good day, greetings. My name's Mark Thomas with the Smart Cities Council, the regional lead for New Zealand. Welcome to this webinar on infrastructure resilience, connected communities. I'll just give it a moment or two as people come online, because I know that it's not the case that everyone is automatically online at the time. I will just give people a little time to come in. I'm with the Smart Cities Council based in Auckland, New Zealand, but we work across Australasia, particularly in New South Wales. And this is an Australasian panel that you're joining today. And look, our intention is not to keep you for more than 45 minutes, just so we say that at the top. Let me get now into the introduction of why you're here, and then we'll do a round with the panelists. So the big idea we want to explore in this session is how to leverage technology to build community resilience in the infrastructure kind of context. And what we'll do is take that trans-Tasman perspective, acknowledging the difference in infrastructure and regional needs as best we can. We're not going to be multilingual on this webinar. We've got people who come from New Zealand, there are people who come from Australia, and a couple of us who work across both, but we want to try and keep it to the expertise that we know. And what we're going to try and do is be focused in our responses to make this as useful for you as possible. And Robin, who is coordinating things for us, I'm sure will let us know if there's any questions or comments that we can reflect on. So let's get underway, and let me do a round of introductions. I'll start with Leon, you.
Hey everyone, I'm Leon. I've been working on unifying municipal infrastructure here in the Wellington region, specifically around critical infrastructure and operational technologies. And through that, we've developed a system called Pulse, which is a platform, the public utilities and local services engine. And then through our frameworks around zero trust and governance first security, that enables a platform for unified leadership in smart environments.
Leon, thanks. We'll talk some more about that. And for those perhaps less familiar with Wellington, it's at the bottom of that big island, just behind Leon's left shoulder on the map, the capital city in New Zealand. Tom, could I get you to introduce yourself?
Cool. Yeah, hi all. So I'm a senior lecturer above the bar at the University of Canterbury in civil engineering. My PhD is in risk analysis from the University of Michigan in the United States. But I'm also the Chief Technical Officer of Urban Intelligence, which is a Christchurch-based, so South Island city in New Zealand. And we've developed the Resilience Explorer, which essentially is a software that councils and companies use to evaluate their risk and look at interventions for building resilience.
Tom, good to have you with us. Christchurch, of course, New Zealand's second largest city, and with international experience in being resilient, or experience that's gone international, which I'm sure we'll get some insights from you on. And Sean, to you, please.
My name is Sean Holden. I'm the CEO of the Flinders Ranges Council. We're an outback council, about 4 hours north of Adelaide in South Australia, or about 25 minutes north of the top of the Spencer Gulf. So we're just in the iconic Flinders Ranges, only 20 minutes from the sea, and basically it's agriculture, pastoralism and tourism, which drives our community of around 1,600 people.
And we established, Sean, didn't we, in the introduction, you've got 1,600 people in this vast area. That's not a lot smaller than the Auckland region, which has 1.7 million. So you would have some very particular and acute challenges, which we'll be interested in exploring. We're going to proceed with this webinar looking at 3 sections. So again, the big idea is leveraging technology for community resilience. But we're going to look at, firstly, critical infrastructure resilience in cities. So what are the key issues there? Secondly, city ownership of communication networks. So this is really, okay, communication networks are obviously a core enabling element in a resilient system. What are the issues associated with community networks that are relevant to this topic? And then lastly, disaster response strategies. So those are the 3 labels we're given to how we're proceeding with this. And let's start with the specific idea of critical infrastructure resilience in towns and cities. What are some of the insights that panelists can bring to that? And Tom, can I just get you to kick off from your experience?
Cool. Yeah, obviously Christchurch has had its fair share of hazards, but so too has the rest of the country. And I think a lot of our research has been around what we call cascading failures or cascading risk through interdependent infrastructure networks. And that became really acute following Cyclone Gabrielle, and particularly in the Hawke's Bay, where there was a grid exit point, so an electricity substation essentially that was down, but we couldn't access it to repair it. And so that is an example of an indirect failure. What we've been doing, what our research has shown, particularly in Christchurch, is that when we look beyond those direct implications of where a property is affected and start to think about how a property could lose power, lose wastewater, lose water supply because of that sequence or domino effect, we see that we end up with orders of magnitude increase in the number of people and properties burdened. So that translates into displacement time for residents and downtime for properties, for businesses. And then, of course, isolation is a key one as well. And both of those have fairly major implications for equity or the distribution of impacts. So that's where, a lot of our work has been on the research behind that from an academic perspective, and then operationalizing that through the Resilience Explorer, so that we can identify who's affected, how they're affected, and what that kind of domino pathway was, which helps us with identifying more effective interventions, because obviously it's best to target up the top.
No, look, that's right. Hawke's Bay is, you can, in the North Island, down the bottom on the east-hand side, it's about 180,000 people all up, 14,000 square kilometres, famous for wine. And so, Tom, your clients or the people or agencies you're dealing with the tools, can you just maybe talk a little bit about who they are? Yeah,
so we work with a lot of councils, but basically anyone with spatially distributed assets who are trying to understand their risk from various natural hazards, and then understanding how those risks either cascade or compound, and then identifying what those strategies are. And I think the key thing about capturing those that domino effect is if you're not doing that, the cost effectiveness of an intervention is artificially low. We work with councils around New Zealand and some government in the Pacific and some state governments in Australia.
Great. Look, Tom, thanks for that. Leon, I want to get to you, please, just with your insights on this issue of critical infrastructure resilience, and what are the tools and capabilities you bring to assist?
Yeah, so building on what Tom said, nationally we have these concepts of lifelines. That's our water infrastructure, our electricity infrastructure, our transport networks, and then on top of there you can start building out those risk profiles. What we are proposing is a digital lifeline that interconnects all of the operational technologies that run these systems, and then think about unified ways or to share that connectivity details across jurisdictions.
Terrific. And again, just talk, Leon, about the kind of agencies or council you're working with.
Yeah, so we're working with Porirua City Council and South Wairarapa City Council, as well as in discussions with the big changes in the water infrastructure here happening in Wellington.
Great. So within the Wellington region, there are, is it 6 or 7 LGAs, Leon? 6 or 7 councils, Porirua and the other one you mentioned are 2 of the ones that are there, right?
That's right. We also have a regional council.
That's right.
It's quite a few of them out there. The biggest thing that we face as a city is the seismic scenario. We have quite a vulnerability called the 7 Islands, which isolates those lifelines across many of the jurisdictions, but those lifelines are split for a period of 3 to 6 months. Where wastewater could be uncertain.
And look, I guess the sobering experience, one of the many from the Christchurch earthquakes, of course, is that all of the planning the New Zealand government did, all of the strategizing and pre-work for seismic events did not involve Christchurch. Wellington, in fact, of course, is the poster child for where we expect the event to happen. And it's not as if you haven't had issues, for sure. But that just is a message to councils that it'll be on everyone's list somewhere. Unfortunately, the way the dice sometimes roll is it ends up landing in an area that possibly might not be on necessarily a higher risk profile. So part of what we're talking about today is tools and strategies to at least be aware of and to get across, so as to try to build into your resilience planning. Let's jump the ditch, Sean, and just get your perspective on this issue of critical infrastructure. If you're just on mute, Sean, if you just want to switch back on.
You think after all these years I'd know this. Our threats, if you like, to our resiliency are flood, bushfire, drought, which we're going through our worst drought in 150 years, 3 years of failed crops, bushfire, and funnily enough, earthquakes. South Australia has a fault running all the way through it, and in fact it goes through Hawker, which is 45 minutes from where I am in a town called Corn. So we've got a fair few threats, depending on the year and depending on what seems and what turn it is. We have to mitigate against these. And the biggest issue for us is the tyranny of distance and the lack of scale. Lack of scale means that our communication providers in particular, we don't turn a buck for them. So unless they're instructed or got money from the federal government, we don't get a lot of love in terms of infrastructure upgrades, and when in fact we're the ones who actually need it, which is odd. So our most vulnerable, really I look at this through who are the most vulnerable in our community, tends to be our older cohort, which we have a great deal of. Younger people tend to leave regional areas and go to the cities. And these people are invariably living by themselves in their homes. We don't have old folks' homes. And they are reliant on machines and technology to keep them alive and to alert the nearby hospital if there's an issue. When the power goes down, and only in October last year, 19 poles went down, meaning we were out of power for 5 days, 6 days, and it meant that landlines didn't work for phones, nor did mobile phone, the technology, and so we had a lot of people feeling more vulnerable perhaps than they otherwise were and are. So that's where my focus really is on. Sure, businesses lose money due to freezes and things not being on, but it's really about those more vulnerable that are top of my concern list.
Sean, given how vast your area is, I mean, I guess you're preoccupied with your area. To what extent are you able to collaborate, share insights, perhaps with, again, Australia is so big, with similar councils that are in your situation, vast territories and relatively small, perhaps, resources and people?
Yeah, we have such things called a Zone Emergency Management Committee, which has, I think, around 8 or 9 councils that feed into that. We have 68 councils in South Australia, 51 are regional. We have 6 that touch on our boundaries, and we meet in person and virtually using technology to do that, to share ideas, issues, challenges and opportunities. And that seems to work really well, not just when we think there may be an issue. We do a lot of it in the pre-planning, learning from the last time and new technology, new ways of doing things. But as always seems to happen is that we have all these plans in place. Then when something actually happens, the urgency, everything goes out the window. Someone's not available, something goes down, and we still have issues.
No, look, that's right. Look, guys, thanks for that overview of some of the elements to think about, some of the tools also to think about in this area of infrastructure, critical infrastructure resilience. And so what we've tried to canvass again, I suppose, is both the approach that's taken and then some of the actual advice, capability, digital tools or strategies that are brought to bear, and of course some insights in terms of some of the people, vulnerable communities that could be impacted. Let's move on to communications networks, which is our second big theme. And I mean, the idea here is how do we maintain essential communications networks from a resilience planning, strategizing point of view. Leon, can I go to you first just for your insights into this area?
Yeah, so one thing we see lacking is municipal infrastructure providers don't tend to have the correct right access, the ability to control and manage and maintain their communication platforms. we tend to see a lot of things like IoT systems and the networks that run them may be passed on to another provider. And so it kind of segments our ability to interconnect them through digital channels due to multiple authentication methods and whatnot. What we're doing is we're thinking about building out our communications infrastructure in a very similar way to that of our water infrastructure and our transport networks, where they're run by the municipal infrastructure providers of the council, and now we have control as a community to build up on top of them.
Can you just talk some more about that, Leon? Because that's an interesting idea, right? Saying that effectively this kind of core asset needs to be thought about in a different way.
Yeah, so the main thing is the ability to respond in an emergency scenario. And in many cases, like that of Sean's, the communication providers are just putting it out there as it's a must. They need to get connected as much as possible. But in the event of a fault, they might not have the resources around to respond in a manner that meets the needs of a city. So what we're working, especially, and you see that within Wellington City, is a shift to actually take back ownership of their IT systems and think about more sort of ways we can manage them very similar to that of how we sort of manage our water infrastructure. We can have right access, we can control the IP of it, and us as cities, the community actually owns that digital infrastructure, and it becomes a more lightweight operation for a city to own and operate.
And Leon, I'm assuming you're saying there's still going to be a role for external kind of insight provider, but it just changes that dynamic, doesn't it, between perhaps the outsource model that a number of councils use?
Yes. No, there's definitely still a role for expertise to come in and teach and train and build up networks. For example, Chorus will always play a big component in infrastructure providing around fiber networks, but it's how we connect to them as communities and then build upon the operational technologies on top of it.
And look, just talk some more about that last point of the challenge with new and emerging technologies. So the challenge everybody has is well, when I say they know what they've got, we know sometimes there are even challenges knowing exactly what you have from an asset management point of view. But let's make an assumption people know what they have. Mm-hmm. What's an approach to take with adding, for example, as you know, some councils are trialing AI, for example, as part of its element. What are that's because it's effectively a sort of software application. It's easier to integrate, although it can be challenging from a policy point of view. What's some insight you can share about this vexed issue of the way to integrate or evolve legacy systems with new emerging digital solutions?
Yes. So I think unification of the systems in a smart city is utmost key. And if we think about, for example, our camera systems we have across Wellington, NZTE will have a camera system, Wellington City Council will manage a camera system and potentially multiple as well. And same with that of Greater Wellington Regional Council. So as we're putting all this infrastructure in to connect up systems, for example, like the vision systems, why don't we provide a unified platform that they all connect into? And we think about leveraging identity in more sort of advanced ways to gain access to that. And then we get to really good ways of then tapping on AI to the side if we want to bring in that. And we can control it in a more data sovereign manner. Let's keep the data local, it's a shared platform. And then depending on your accessibility, so for example, in a Seven Islands event, we might want to start opening up that critical infrastructure and those cameras to the likes of the Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office.
Terrific. And NZTA is the New Zealand Transport Agency, so that's the government agency with the sort of government level control, analogous to Transport for New South Wales, which is the one I'm familiar with, and all states I think will have that sort of agency that's typically state-based in Australia, although there is, of course, a federal agency too. Did you want to talk more about the Seven Islands scenario, Ian?
Yeah, so one thing we see we're working with Porirua City Council on is they've got a lot of things like water reservoirs around the city, generators that are owned by that city council. But in the event of a emergency, how can they provide access to that information, or how do they even ensure that they have the information available when they actually need it? And so that's a lot of the philosophies we have. How do we collect the data locally? We empower our local communities to be able to run and control this infrastructure. So when we actually need to rely on it, we have the teams there to make appropriate action.
Leon, thank you. Let me, Sean, move to you, please. Again, maintaining essential communication networks. What are the issues that you bring to that challenge?
Look, it's the cost of the provision of power and communications to those providers. I can totally understand that. It doesn't help the situation, however. So it is all about pre-planning. It's all about what happens during the event and then also what happens afterwards. So with a lot of lobbying and advocacy, we have secured a pilot battery that will go into the community in Hawker, 265 people there. Interestingly, around 800,000 tourists go through there. So it's not just for the 265 people that are there, and it'll keep things going for a couple of days. But what tends to happen in Hawker in particular, it's longer than that. So it'll be a pilot to see how that works, best attached to which infrastructure. So, for example, it's attached to the sports centre so that people that are vulnerable can go there if it's extremely hot or extremely cold, etc. And there are showers and so on. So an emergency centre, if you will, by proxy with this particular battery. We're looking for a bit more than that. That when infrastructure is ruined through a natural event, that it's put back better. That it's built so that whatever was the reason for it falling down in the first place or failing in the first place is embedded in embedded in what infrastructure it replaces it. Not the same, therefore it's going to happen again. It sounds obvious, but this has been happening over and over again, and not just in South Australia. Building back better tends to mean more costly, and so rather than having the money for 19 transmission poles that fell down, you might only have the money for 12 that are built back better, and the other 7 you have to wait for some more funding. This is the tricky part with all of this. Not everybody's sold on the whole building it back better, for example.
Sean, you've commented also on that in some regional areas there might be a lack of momentum, not perhaps through not wanting to, but for some of the reasons and challenges you've talked about. And you're thinking that that cities can take more of a lead. Is there a greater role for cities to help?
Yeah, one thing. Yeah, and the chat about momentum. I think one of the things that happens is that we get branded in regional Australia as being resilient, and it's a badge of honour. It's also a throwaway line and a little bit glib and a little bit pithy, frankly. And so, but what happens is with this badge of honour of, well, we choose to live out here, we are resilient, and after a while you end up accepting some things. So that whilst there's an emphasis on something, a natural event, a flood and so on, and we all work hard to mitigate against that, once that's gone, there's a new story the next day, the next week, the next month, and everybody goes back to normal. So that momentum really should be about once is too many times, and resilience should really be turned into understanding and learnings so that we can mitigate better against that, the effects of it the first time around. Cities absolutely can lead for regional areas because they've got scale, and so things can be trialled, particularly in terms of that initial investment in a new idea can be trialled in the cities. And there can be learnings from that, and then we can adapt and adopt.
Sure. Look, thanks for that. We're at about the 2/3 point, people who are listening and who will watching. And so please feel free to put comments or questions in the chat, and I can feed that into the conversation. We've covered off then just at a high level some of the critical infrastructure resilience issues in the first session, and we've just finished now a discussion around some of the maintenance demands and pressures in the essential communications network area. Our third section is on effective disaster response strategies. And so the assumption is that you've built in some critical infrastructure resilience design into the system. You've established communications network maintenance facilities, but you still have a disaster, which of course is the comment we made at the start. So, Tom, can I go to you first in terms of the insight that urban intelligence and you can bring to what cities and regions could be doing in this situation?
Yeah, I think funnily enough, the key is engagement prior to the disaster. And I think things like Build Back Better or adaptation planning, the most effective way is if we have those plans in place, or at least the start of conversations in place prior to an event, because you've got as Sean said, you've got the momentum immediately after, and maybe in some cases you'll have that maybe 18 months afterwards before people really go back to normal and don't want to talk about it anymore. So but when we talk about adaptation plans, we're talking about essentially setting these tripwires that say, well, if this happens, or if the risk increases because of changing storm severity or sea level rise or whatever, or wildfire conditions, what have you, you have some idea of what you might want to do. But that requires engagement prior to, and tools like the Resilience Explorer and others that let you visualize that risk and talk to communities, because it's so abstract without being able to say on a map, like, this is what a hazard is, looks like today, this is how it might change in the future. And we're not singling you out here. Like, when we engage with this community, we can show you the full risk profile for your community, for the wider district or region, but we're slowly working through. I think that's one of the challenges, especially in what we see in Christchurch, is that there are some areas that still feel hard done by following the earthquake, and that lack of trust then makes it really difficult to have those subsequent conversations. And probably the last thing I'll say is that having that engagement and trust is really important. There was research in Littleton, which is one of the communities in Christchurch, that showed one of the most effective responses was where the community had an existing really strong relationship through what they called a time bank system, where people would volunteer their time to help each other out. And that was in place prior to the disaster, prior to the earthquake. But that network kind of kicked off again afterwards. But the emergency response that came down from a more top level wasn't set up to integrate into those networks. And that's was probably one of the big lessons in Christchurch, was how do we pre-build those relationships so that they can, the pre-existing community networks can be utilized.
Tom, I've got a question, and I'll just make a comment whilst perhaps you think about it. But if you could draw on a case study of someone who perhaps has either had the experience or in fact had done the preparation using the resilience tool you've talked about, and effectively, because they had that, because they'd done the planning or because they had the tool, they were able to get a better outcome. If there's a case study or an example you could refer to, that would be helpful. And the reason I asked that, just whilst you're thinking of that, is I was an elected member of the Auckland Council for 2 terms in the early part of its establishment. And I can recall going to numerous meetings on continuity planning, and we had a small team who did gigabytes and gigabytes of documentation on continuity planning. And then 2 years ago, we had devastating floods in Auckland. And the reviews, of course, that were done said that all that good work that was done wasn't adequate enough, which wasn't a criticism of the people involved, but it was clearly a criticism of the system and the so-called preparation that had been done. So just interested in your insights and, if possible, an example of it worked here.
Yeah. Well, for the Resilience Explorer, because we've only been operating 2 years, we haven't. This is where things get a bit morbid, is that you need that confluence of events to have those examples. But the Diamond Harbour adaptation plan that's just been adopted by Christchurch City is probably one of the best in the world in terms of scale and engagement that's gone into it. And I think that
that could be a reference people could Google.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? It's available online, and I think that just getting people having those conversations and identifying who's who is starts the conversation prior to a disaster, even if they don't think that they need it. I think Buller in Westport is probably even bolder, where they started talking about relocating the town. There's a lot of resident pushback from residents at the moment, but it's a plan that's available so that when there's another major flood of the Buller River, people have something to turn to. There's some straw man at the very least in place.
Tom, thanks. And look, Westport, in New Zealand terms, very small and quite isolated town on the South Island's west coast, about behind where Leon's shoulder is now.
Yeah.
Tom, thanks for that. Sean, I'm coming to you next, but I've actually got a question that's come through from one of the people on the webinar. And Sean, the question is, from a council perspective, can you talk to the practicalities of infrastructure failure? So how do we get communication to residents immediately at present, particularly risky residents? So infrastructure fails. What are you able to do currently in terms of getting information to residents, given the huge challenges you have that you've described with the size of and small bases?
Look, it's a tricky one, and I could hide behind the fact that for the example I gave, it's a South Australian health issue. My question to them was, I will answer the question, but my question to them was, does someone go around physically and see these people, knock on their door and see if they're okay, the human help? And yes, apparently they do, but that's limited because we don't have a lot of staffing out here. We probably have more patients than we do staff, so that does make it very difficult. From a council point of view, we're looking at exactly that, and I'm listening intently with what's clearly happening in New Zealand, and I'm not aware if any of this is happening in Australia. I haven't worked at that level. But certainly we are working with Telecom right now. We're working with the NBN, National Broadband Network in Australia, and other players of how we can do exactly that. We've got a meeting in Hawker on the 15th of May to talk about exactly these issues. It's an interesting one because I think we're still paper and pen. We still haven't adopted technology like I think we should. And ultimately, though, it does need some kind of energy source that if the main energy source goes down, and obviously, we're talking about generators and so on, and most businesses and a lot of the hospitals and so on have generators, but they have a shelf life as well. So yeah. It is difficult to answer that. The infrastructure largely is not ours; it's state government. Yeah. So all we can do is have better relationships and communication lines with them.
Sean, I want to come back and talk some more about some of the insights you have in this area of effective disaster response, but we've got some questions. And a question to all of you is, and I'm going to give you the question and then just provide a bit of context whilst you think, what do we do when the internet goes down? That's the question to all of you. The context from this person is Cyclone Alfred recently impacted large parts of southeast Queensland. Media provided regional scale information and updates, referred residents to websites for localised information, power outages, road closures. However, large numbers of people had also lost internet access. So the question is, how do we balance the provision of local versus regional info? And what are the backup plans when the internet goes down? Who would like to respond to that?
Well, frankly, when the internet goes down for council, we've got a generator. And that keeps a lot of what we do going because local government councils are service providers, and often in a regional setting like us, we're the service of last resort because the state government, the federal government don't reach out here. So it does become quite difficult. I guess what's in our favour is we're not talking about a lot of people either, but they are far-flung, and so we need to get out to those people. So when the internet goes down, we do what we can, and largely we leave the office and go out and see people, which is probably what we should be doing anyway, more of. Sure.
And look, I appreciate it probably is really a question for the council perspective. So I know, again, from the experience I have with council, what civil defence try to do is to identify potential at-risk communities. And so there has to be the contemplation that the ability to conventionally communicate goes. And so you identify in advance the at-risk communities, and then you mobilise. You send task forces out, and so that's the situation we've had happen. Of course, very challenging in much more remote communities. Leon, Tom, did either of you want to take a pass on that, or I can move on?
Yeah, no, I'd like to just mention the concept of a smart hub, which could be where you're putting that battery, Sean, and the sports centre. So these are community assets that in times of prosperity, we can leverage them to have a sports centre, but in times of emergency, they turn into operational smart hubs, which that's the place we're collecting our infrastructure data, our monitoring data from our operational technologies, but we're also allowed to present it out from there. So, for example, in the Porirua, we are looking at using Starlink as a backup technology in these with small battery backups that we can just use to push minor updates out to our what we're proposing as digital displays. Hey, here's a community asset, it's a library. We've got all the data locally, and we can use the multiple technologies we have, such as 3G, radio, fiber, or satellite, to start dispersing this community information in meaningful ways.
Certainly,
Liam, thanks.
Certainly on that, Mark. Sorry, my recent experience of 4 years in the Northern Territory, talk about remote, Starlink is a saviour, particularly up in North Queensland, Northern Territory, Northern Western Australia. And now I know there's been a pilot program the last 3 years to link all of them up to do seemingly exactly what you're talking about.
Perfect.
We need to move on. I'm just also aware that some councils will have designated go-to places. So as part of their planning, they'll say, well, actually, if you know nothing and we can't get to you, and you need to leave, because of course, as we all know, if there's a crisis or an emergency, you normally shelter in place. That in the case of Auckland Council, I know it does have designated facilities that say, actually, if you need assistance and cannot contact anyone, make your way as safely as you can here. Let's just finish off this disaster response strategy, because I have to finish one more question that's come through. Sean, just in terms of your perspective on disaster response, did you want to talk anything more about the coordination, communication challenge that sometimes exists?
Yeah, and certainly the technology is a large part of it, but as long as it's got electricity. If it doesn't, and that tends to be our issue, it does fall down a lot. I think there's what we need. It's a yin and a yang thing, because in regional anywhere, it's all about personalities, and a lot of them have been doing it for so long and they do it their way. They tend to be my age and getting up towards mid-50s and 60s. Technology is a challenge and we don't want to use it. And yet we've got people coming through now with the technology. So it's really probably a mindset thing, is how do we mix in the new technologies that are coming through with people that aren't necessarily that inclined to use them. And in that space is where things can go awry, unfortunately.
Sean, thank you. Leon, I'm going to come to you for a last comment in this section, and then I'm going to finish with the question for all. I'm going to ask my question for all, so Tom and Sean can start to think about it, because I'm coming to Tom first with it. The question is, what is the catalyst for change that we need? Specifically, how could industry collaborate more or better to support this idea of building back better in some kind of a crisis scenario? So what more could industry collaboration do? Have a think about that. I'll come to you first, Tom. Leon, just finally on disaster response strategy, what are some of the insights that you and Amiga can bring to that challenge?
Yeah, I think we've touched on a lot of them here, but the main thing is where we aggregate our sensor data, how we go about supporting that infrastructure in times of need, ensuring that us as communities have maintenance and control and sovereignty over that data. And from there, we can really relay it out in really meaningful ways via the likes of what we mentioned before, audio networks. A lot of these cameras can be then shared cross-jurisdictionally, as well as water infrastructure. So I always picture the Seven Islands event, but we still have access to all our digital displays, and we can power them because they're quite lightweight to do. And then now we're feeding out really useful information rather than just comms that might come periodically over VHF or UHF radio.
Leon, look, thanks a lot. That completes the three broad themes, but the final question I'll come back to and come to you first, Tom. What is the catalyst for change we need? Specifically, how could industry collaborate more or better to support building back better or providing more resilient support locally?
Yeah, so I think probably the short answer is breaking down some of the silos. And when we think about, a lot of my research is around climate change risk, and we talk about that as a systemic or a complex risk, where major issues with perception of the challenges and like siloed thinking or short-term thinking, and being able to start to identify risk consistently between different agencies and understanding the dependencies between those agencies or the infrastructures, so that when we start to evaluate cost-benefit analysis for Building Back Better and other types of initiatives, or preferably proactive adaptation, we can co-fund that across different, essentially the beneficiaries. So I think it's that, how do we get people on the same page with the same risk understanding so that the right hand is talking to the left, and that's harder than it should be.
For sure. Just a couple of minutes to go, guys. Sean, over to you for your catalyst for change.
Yeah, the catalyst for change. Yeah, for local government, particularly in my area, is to act and think regionally rather than just ourselves. Get ourselves around a table, identify what we think our challenges and opportunities are, clearly articulate those to industry and government, and provide a space that they can come and present and show their wares, if you like, or their answers to our issues. And from there, work out with the government some kind of grant program that could assist the industry with these answers, because invariably the answers are coming from pretty small businesses, not large ones. It's not coming from your Telstras, etc., that you could self-fund. It's coming from others that have come up with these ideas, and they need support to be able to help us.
Look, Sean, that's great. Leon, to finish off, your catalyst for boosting industry collaboration.
Yeah, one of our big foundations that we run on is a triadic relationship model between community, industry, and academia. And I think that collaboration is absolutely key as we build out smart city infrastructure. And as long as we can work together and learn how to build best now, I think we'll be able to really rally in times of need, and in times of prosperity, we all sort of win with, lower cost of services, more reliable services, and better platforms to innovate on.
Guys, look, thank you for the session. We're coming to a close. And look, our point here was to provide some insights and commentary on how to leverage technology for community resilience. This, of course, because it's a smart cities conversation, hasn't just been about technology, because we know for technology to be effective, there's a whole range of smart practices identifying vulnerable communities that need to come into play as well. We've looked at three key areas. What are the critical infrastructure resilience aspects? And we've heard particularly Leon and Ton talk about the particular digital capability and tools that they have. And so just Google Omega or Urban Intelligence if you want more information from that. We then went into the critical ownership of communication networks and had terrific insight from Sean about the real challenges he faces in his particularly, well, I'd say unique situation, but of course in Australia, there are others like you, and we have smaller versions of those here in New Zealand. And then lastly, you've heard us just talk about, and maybe one of the sort of powerful sessions, disaster response strategies. What are the things that we need to bear in mind as we plan to ultimately make communities more resilient? Look, everyone, thanks so much for participating. This, of course, will be published on the Smart Cities platform. We've had good engagement and good attendance. Thank you for those who made contributions, and thank you all for giving up your time. I hope it's been of use. Take care, travel safely.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks all.
Cheers, everyone.